Okay, we're back. We're on page 27, starting at besides. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. All right, here we go. Besides being a famous fossil hunter, Louis Leakey worked hard to protect the wildlife of Africa. He also helped the careers of two young women who wanted to study wild animals in Africa. One was Jane Goodall, the other was Dian Fossey, who became famous for her work with gorillas. Gorillas in the Mist is a movie about Dian Fossey and her work. Louis Leakey died in 1972 while visiting Jane Goodall's mother, Vaughan, in England. We are on page 28. At Olduvai Gorge in the plains of East Africa, the Leakeys led groups on digs to find fossils. Not dinosaur fossils. The Leakeys were looking for fossils of the very earliest humans. Most scientists at the time thought that the first humans were from Asia. Louis believed they were from Africa, and he was right. In 1960, he came upon fossils of a very early human species. It came to be known as Homo habilis. Homo habilis lived on Earth from about 2.3 to 1.4 million years ago. It looked more like an ape than like a modern human being. It had a small head, was short, and had very long arms. From the moment Louis Leakey met Jane, he liked her. She had a shy manner, but he could tell she was smart and had a spirit of adventure. He offered her a job, and naturally Jane took it. Jane worked as Leakey's secretary at a museum in the city of Nairobi, Kenya. But right away, Leakey gave her the chance to dig for fossils at Olduvai Gorge. Page 30. Jane had never done this type of work before. She didn't know anything about digging for fossils, but she was a fast learner. For hours every day, Jane picked away at the clay and rocks with small tools. Sometimes she unearthed a bone of a creature from the distant past, but usually she found nothing. The work was tiring. During the dry season, the Olduvai Gorge was like a desert. Even so, it was a wonderful time for Jane. She wrote that it was a wild, untouched Africa. There were all the animals of my childhood dreams. She saw lions, a rhinoceros, and loads of gazelles. She saw dik-diks, which are little antelopes the size of a fox terrier. From Louis Leakey, Jane learned about the chimpanzees living in the forest near Lake Tanganyika. They were long-haired chimpanzees. Leakey was interested in chimps because he believed that they had much in common with early humans. Wild chimps are found only in Africa, nowhere else in the world. One study had been done on wild chimps. However, it had lasted for less than 3 months. Leakey thought that much more time was needed to learn anything important about the chimps. Jane had no experience. This was her first time in Africa. Yet he believed Jane Goodall was the right person for the job, and Jane did too. In July 1960, she moved to the Gombe Stream Game Reserve, in which is now the country of Tanzania. First she met the 2 African scouts who protected the area. Then Jane set off to take a quick look around. Her life's work was about to begin. We're on page 33, chapter 3. Life in the Wild. What was it like to live at Gombe Stream in 1960? Steel gray mountains rose up from the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika. In the valleys between the slopes were forests. It was completely wild. There were no tourists, no safari groups with cameras, and no fancy lodges to stay in. Jane lived near the lake in a little clearing by a small stream. She was cut off from the rest of the world. Even the town of Kigoma was an hour boat ride away. On page 34-35. Who besides Jane lived at the campsite. In addition to a cook named Dominic, there was one very important person, Jane's mother Vaughan. Vaughan stayed with Jane for the first 4 months at Gombe. Mother and daughter lived in the same old army tent together. It had 2 cots and a separate area for washing up. Mosquito netting covered the front of the tent. Their toilet was outside. It was a deep hole surrounded by a fence. Vaughn was a middle-aged woman. Living like this was hard for Jane. It had to be twice as hard for Vaughn. Yet officials in Africa had refused to let Jane go off alone to Gombe. They were worried about the safety of a young woman living alone. There was no way Vaughn was going to let Jane pass up this chance to live with chimps. Already past 50, Vaughn packed up for Africa. It is easy to see where Jane's bravery came from. Having Vaughn share these first months meant so much to Jane. It was better than having a best friend along. In the evening when she returned to camp, Vaughn was there. They'd have dinner and chat. Vaughn kept Jane company while she wrote up her notes from that day. At first, she wrote, page 36, 37. First she wrote by hand on lined paper. Later she got a portable typewriter. What did Vaughn do all day while Jane was out exploring? Vaughn set up a little clinic. She provided basic health care to the local families. She handed out aspirin and cleaned cuts. Sometimes she helped deliver babies. 38, 39. About once every 2 weeks, Jane and Vaughn went by boat into Kigoma. In town they picked up mail and enough food and supplies to last until the next trip. They'd stock up on eggs, baked beans, and sausages. At the fruit and vegetable market, they brought bananas, green and yellow oranges, and passion fruit. 2 African scouts lived in huts not far from Jane's camp. One always made the trip into Kigoma with Jane and Vaughn. It was not considered proper for 2 white women to travel alone. The main job of the scouts was to help Jane find her way through the forest. These forests were home to the chimpanzees. Jane, however, did not like having a scout along. Why? 2 people made more noise than 1 person alone in the forest, and noises scared away the chimps. Also, the scouts didn't like to start off as early as Jane. She was always up before dawn, and often the scouts wanted to head back to camp way before Jane did. So after a while, the scouts let Jane explore by herself. Now she was free to go at page 40. She was free to go at her own pace. Sometimes she sat on the ground. Sometimes she perched in trees. She could stay overnight if she wanted. Plus, being alone made it easier to remain unseen by the chimps. Because of how far away the chimps were, Jane carried binoculars with her. She took a tin box with her, too. It contained a sweater, some food, coffee, and a mug. Jane always wore her hair in a ponytail, and she wore the same outfit every day, a tan shirt and tan shorts. Colorful clothes would make her stand out too much. She wanted to blend in with the background. Page 42, 43. Often she had to crawl through tangled vines. She got bitten by flies and scratched by sharp grass, but nothing stopped her. Was Jane Goodall afraid of anything? Yes, she was scared of leopards. She knew the smell of leopards, and many times Jane caught their scent in the forest. One time she had to climb a tree to get away from a leopard. She was lucky. The leopard did not climb up after her. Instead, the leopard pooped on the rock where Jane had been sitting only a few minutes before. Page 44, 45. Jane couldn't see chimps, so how did she know where to look? She knew the sounds that chimps make. Hearing certain cries tipped her off that chimps were in the area. Jane would pick out a spot and sit. She'd stay for hours, quietly waiting and watching. Some days she didn't see any chimps. Even so, she was sure they were watching her. Other days she saw many. Sometimes a few large males would gather together. Sometimes she spotted a mother with her young. Sometimes she caught sight of bigger groups of males, females, and young chimps. The trouble was that the chimps were always so far off, and they never were doing anything very interesting. Jane hoped to spy on chimps playing together, or watch a mother caring for a baby chimp. Instead, all she saw were chimps searching for food. They'd climb up fig trees and pull off fruit. However, the minute Jane tried to move closer to them, the chimps would run away. How was she going to learn anything that mattered? Chapter 4. Jane was discouraged by how little progress she was making with the chimps. Then, to make matters worse, she and Vaughn both got sick. Very sick. Most likely both women had come down with malaria. They had no drugs with them to treat the disease. Jane had been told that there was no malaria at Gome, so she didn't take medicine along. Jane blamed herself for that. For 2 weeks, Jane and her mother never left their tent. All they did was lie in bed and sweat. Malaria is one of the most widespread diseases in the world. People catch it from being bitten by a certain kind of mosquito. Malaria does damage to the liver and to blood cells. The symptoms are high fevers, vomiting, chills, and bad headaches. People in Africa, south of the Sahara Desert, are most at risk for malaria. Insect sprays can kill indoor mosquitoes. Drugs can treat the disease, but as of yet, there is no vaccine to prevent malaria. More than 1 people still die of it every year. Page 49. For many days, Vaughn's fever rose as high as 105 degrees. Both Jane and Vaughn were lucky. They recovered. The minute she felt well enough, Jane returned to the forest. At last, her patience paid off. It was October. Vaughn had gone home to England. Jane was on her own. She began exploring an area she called the Peak. Every day, rain or shine, she climbed up the steep slope of the peak into the forest. Little by little, the chimps became used to Jane watching them. One day she saw a female hold out her hand to a male who kissed it. She saw 2 baby chimps play tug-of-war with a twig. Jane could tell many of the chimps apart, and she gave them names. Flo was an old female chimp. Jane liked Flo a lot. She was a very popular chimp, although, to Jane at least, Flo was funny looking. She had a big round nose and torn ears. Flo had a baby. Jane called her Fifi, and she called Fifi's older brothers Fabin and Figin. Flo was a caring mother. She protected Fifi from the rain. She carefully groomed her young. Grooming means cleaning their fur. Flo was a playful mother, but she was also firm. She never let her children get out of line. Ollie was Flo's friend. Ollie was also a female. Her face was very long and her lips jiggled a lot. Another chimp, a male, looked a lot like Ollie. Jane was quite sure he was Ollie's brother. She named him William. In animal studies, animals are usually given numbers, not names. Page 52. In fact, many scientists think it's a bad idea to name animals that are being studied. They worry that it will make the animals seem too human. Jane definitely did not think of the chimps as humans, but she did see the chimps as individuals. They had different personalities. William was timid and fearful. Gilko was a show-off, always looking for attention. Frodo was a bully, a dangerous bully. One time, Jane had been watching Frodo when suddenly he charged. He beat and kicked her. Frodo started to leave, then came back, beat Jane more, and dragged her to the edge of a cliff. What did Frodo do next? He threw her over the side. It was a steep drop, but luckily there were bushes that stopped Jane's fall. Even so, she was banged up pretty bad.